Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Shri N. Vohra, Mr. Shrivastava, Excellencies and distinguished guests, a very warm welcome to a very special event this evening with Ambassador Rao on Diplomacy Today, a Woman's Agenda. This event is particularly significant. It is the formal unveiling of a new and important initiative at the India International Center on Engendering the Discourse. And it is aptly christened Her Voice. And it marks the center's Diamond Jubilee celebrations. Her Voice is an attempt to foreground the autonomous movements, engagements, experiences, and contributions of women on deepening democracy and voicing citizenship, reclaiming space, spanning the arts, politics, economy, literature, law, environment, and of course, peace and security. Her Voice is also part celebration and part acknowledgement of the contributions of two very inspiring women, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, whose spirit and imagination energized and in many ways shaped the ethos of the India International Center. Her Voice is not a feminized cloister. It attempts to bring perspectives to further enrich and nuance the discourse at the IIC. It offers conceptual alphabets for other ways of being and seeing. And it is often said that the 21st century belongs to women. But how should this play out? At one level, it must involve bringing a dialogic sensibility, a sensibility of inclusion, of justice, of active listening, the ethics of care, of connectedness, and of course of decolonizing the mind and interrogating the monocultures of the mind, and bringing this all squarely into the civic sphere to craft a more humane, sustainable world that works for all, not just for women. Up until the last decades of the 20th century, the voices of women who hold up half the sky and who are disproportionately impacted by conflict and war were seldom heard in the meta-narratives of national security. For too long, the domain of international relations and practice and politics remained an area of diffidence, largely untenanted by women. But things began to change, owing to the efforts of feminist international relations scholars, owing to the normative international frameworks and instruments that emanated from CEDAW, from the exhortations and deliberations at the UN conferences on the status of women at Mexico, at Rio, at Copenhagen, Nairobi, Beijing, and of course, also owing to the landmark United Nations Security Council resolutions 1325 plus, mandating the participation of women in all negotiations on peace and security, and providing impetus to what's today called the WPS agenda, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. All this, combined with the energy of women's movements at the grassroots, especially from the global south, contributed to a groundswell of opinion demanding voice, space, and power at the high tables where decisions that impact lives are made and where peace is often brokered. This counter-hegemonic impulse involved the interrogation of purely state-centric or military-centric notions of security and questioning of the realism and zero-sum game approaches that have dominated international political discourse. It also involved a critique of war and the cultures of militarism and violence, of muscular populism, of nuclearization, and the gendering of citizenship. Entering the arena largely through the corridors of human security around the twin axes of freedom from fear and freedom from want, and also foregrounding what were considered the erstwhile soft issues, women critiqued the reified language of techno-strategic discourse, concepts like collateral damage, strike capacity that often obfuscate the cost to human lives. As Mahbubul Haq had once said, human security is a child that did not die, a disease that did not spread, a job that was not cut, an ethnic tension that did not explode in violence, a dissident who was not silenced, and that human security is not a concern with weapons, it is a concern with human life and dignity. And I end quote. So what of women in diplomacy and the foreign policy space? Since 2014, when Sweden's Foreign Minister Margot Wallström announced the world's explicitly feminist foreign policy, there has been a buzz around the concept, with both supporters and some skeptics who balk at the term feminist when applied to foreign policy. But today, Canada, France, Mexico, Scotland, Luxembourg, and Spain, among others, have adopted the principles that are inherent to what is termed feminist foreign policy, even though they may not label it as such. The push to bring the WPS issues, the women, peace and security issues, to inform the changing contours of diplomacy has been propelled by several women leaders the world over. And there has of late been quite literally a chorus of voices internationally with growing reverberations in our own region, underscoring the need for a gender-sensitive foreign policy. But nearly 7 decades earlier, 2 intrepid women who were members of India's Constituent Assembly had shown remarkable prescience on these issues. Hansa Mehta was single-handedly responsible for amending a critical feature of the UN Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. She persuaded Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then chair, to change the earlier text to ensure it contained more gender-sensitive language. And this she did when she served as the Indian delegate to the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1947. And she got the text changed from all women are born free and equal. I'm sorry, from all men are born free and equal to all human beings are born free and equal. Also, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the first woman to be elected as president of the UN General Assembly and served as ambassador to Moscow, to Washington, Mexico, and also as High Commissioner to London and Dublin. And later she was the Indian representative to the UNHRC, famously told a global audience many decades ago, let us sweat in peace and not bleed in war. So do women diplomats indeed speak in a different voice as they balance the normative and realist impulses of foreign policy? How far can they push the envelope in the framing of issues on national interest and peace and security? Do they provide an alternative lexicon? Who better to speak to this range of issues from soft power to smart power, without succumbing to false binaries of traditional versus non-traditional security than Ambassador Nirupama Rao herself, who has over the years sought to craft a gender-sensitive approach, an approach that breaks the silence on these issues within our policy establishments. And she has done this in uniquely imaginative and significant ways. To list her many accomplishments would take us well past dinner. So just a few highlights. From the time Nirupama Rao joined the diplomatic service at the age of 22, after acing the exam, she has made it almost a habit to shatter glass ceilings. She was India's first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, the first woman High Commissioner of India to Sri Lanka, a very sensitive posting, and the first woman ambassador to the People's Republic of China, another extremely sensitive posting. She was India's second woman foreign secretary, and at the end of her term was appointed India's ambassador to the United States. And she wears her many hats, or shall I say many scarves, with her characteristic, dignified confidence. She has seamlessly straddled the worlds of diplomacy, academia, the arts, and literature. She has taught at Columbia and Brown universities in the United States. She has held the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship, 2014. She was visiting scholar at the India-China Institute at the New School in New York, a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center, Washington, D.C., practitioner in residence of the prestigious Bellagio Center in Italy. She's a Pacific Leadership Fellow at the University of California, San Diego, and is currently a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. In 2018, she received the Fellowship of Peace Award conferred by the Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Center at Washington, D.C., and the Rani Lakshmibai Award by the Government of Kerala, and of course, the KPS Menon Memorial Award in 2010 for her work in diplomacy. She's also been listed among the 100 most influential women by foreignpolicy.com, and she has a degree of Doctor of Letters, honoris causa, and serves as a member of several boards of think tanks, educational institutions, and arts foundations. She pursues her passion for music. Her album, Peace is My Dream, transports you to another realm of experience, as does her book of poems, Rain Rising. And in 2018, she set up the South Asian Symphony Orchestra, a cultural SARC plus to build peace in the region, drawing on the talents of young people from the 8 countries of the SARC region, and to realize her dream of fostering and reviving a South Asian commons. A woman for all seasons indeed, Nirupama writes extensively, evocatively, even provocatively on the issues at stake, both domestic and international, for an India seeking to consolidate and expand its global footprint. Also, about the values that must animate our democracy in the making, her recent much acclaimed book, The Fractured Himalayas, India, Tibet, and China, 1948 to 1962, magnificently combines the meticulousness of the scholar, researcher, and the mastery of a seasoned practitioner. And it also points to the roads not taken. The woman career diplomat is a quite recent phenomenon. The multiple facets and roles are still theoretically a work in progress and is being scripted and re-scripted by intrepid women like Nirupama Rao. We are all too familiar with the bars and the bands prevalent for women in the Indian Foreign Service till the early 1970s. And yet, independent India had women in the Foreign Office a good 3 years before Britain did. So, who is the diplomat today, and what are the myriad processes she navigates? Between summit diplomacy to shuttle diplomacy to trade diplomacy to public diplomacy, and even dipping into multi-track diplomacy, it is a widely expanding field, and actors do not sit only in the Foreign Office behind walls of secrecy anymore. With escalating security concerns, terrorism, the discontents of globalization, climate change, the information explosion, and the old ways of democracy, of doing diplomacy fading, does the changing global security architecture present only structural challenges, or are there also some enabling spaces? The current crisis in Ukraine have made these questions even more immediate, even more pressing. Nirupama Rao follows in the tradition of gutsy foremothers like Lakshmi N. Menon, C.B. Muttama, Rukmini Menon, Rama Mehta, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, among others, who were not willing to just be ambassadresses or wives of diplomats, a term that carried much currency in the early years of our republic, yet heavily imbued and laden with patriarchy. These women blazed an unusual trail in the spaces they inhabited and helped transform. Through the recent pandemic, the world has watched with much admiration how women heads of state in the Nordic countries, in New Zealand, in Germany, in Taiwan, for example, proactively responded, speaking a different language of empathetic leadership and the ethics of care. We're all familiar with the initiatives of Jacinda Ardern, of Angela Merkel, Sanna Marin of Finland, Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, Katrin Jakobsdottir of Iceland, Emma Solberg of Norway, Mette Frederiksen of Denmark. Not only did they do things differently, they did different things that made a difference. So finally, can there be a different music to which we can retune our syllables, or should I say decibels, on security, peace, and indeed diplomacy? Nirupama Rao herself speaks to this evocatively in an article titled "Have the Women Spoken?", where she underscores the need for a foreign policy that transcends cartographic anxieties. And I quote, "Do we think of a South Asian Commons, not an arena for mutual jousting, where we bait each other in blood sport, but a space for maturity, of peaceful purpose, of robust civility, and mutual accommodation? So why then do we women subscribe to the popularly expressed shibboleths about adversaries, the endless litany of retributive give and take?" End quote. So do you, as a woman diplomat, Nirupama Rao, speak more often in the metaphoric mother tongue, not the stentorian father tongue? Do you also speak more often the language of inclusion, of empathy, of dialogue, the language which is very often on the verge of silence, but always on the verge of song? It is also a language in which all maps can change, the language that can speak truth to power. We await your insights with bated breath. Thank you. And over to Ambassador Rao.
Good evening. Mr. N. Vohra, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, Mr. K. Shrivastava, and dear friends. It is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to be here before you today to deliver one of the IIC Diamond Jubilee lectures on Engendering the Discourse. I'm going to speak to you on diplomacy today, a woman's agenda. We meet here just a few days after we marked International Women's Day, and I cannot help but recall how India's soul was defined by our first Prime Minister as feminine. His exact words were, I quote, "India has always seemed to me to have broadly more the feminine qualities than the masculine. Of course, the masculine qualities are there and have played an important part in her history. Nevertheless, the feminine qualities seem to me to predominate. Essentially, she is gentle and peaceful, even though on occasions she may indulge in brutal and callous behavior. That is why I think that Indian women from whatever part of the country represent the essence of India more perhaps than the men." Unquote. Perhaps Mr. Nehru's definition of women as gentle and peaceful may be judged by some as being stereotypical, although women in general are not responsible for the destruction seen in the world, but must be equal stakeholders in ensuring how we build, rebuild, and restore, and prevent the occurrence of conflict. Women have a reputation for being resilient, and they have internalized forbearance. Yet their voices tend to be lost in the chaos of the recurrent clash of geopolitical ambitions, as also the impact of war and conflict on more than one half of humanity, the dispossessed women and children and elderly who populate the borderlands and frontier zones where the missiles rain down their death and destruction. In general also, as Madeleine Albright once said, women's issues are the hardest issues because they force us to look beyond the default positions of history and social givens. Diplomacy has traditionally been practiced in a world largely populated by men. In countries all over the world, women diplomats have been late entrants to the field, and while their numbers have increased, can we say in all honesty that these statistics show that women have found voice, agency, and identity in this largely male-dominated field? Is it just an add women and stir approach that make the statistical charts look good when informing the public? Are issues of peace and security being redefined to register the aspirations and interests of women on whose shoulders rests the responsibility to nurture future generations of humankind? Women diplomats have to be pioneering wayfarers. The question is whether they make their mark in this regard by redefining set agendas with their own distinct brand and contribution, and where they do more than conform to foreign policy gospel built by generations of male diktat. I'm told that there are today 220 women Foreign Service officers in the Ministry of External Affairs, and that this comprises over 25% of the total number of Indian diplomats. The number of women IFS officers has steadily increased over the years. The MEA strives for a gender-balanced workforce, the aim being to give equal opportunity in terms of promotions and postings. Every sixth senior-level Indian diplomat today is a woman. Over 20 heads of missions or heads of posts, ambassadors and consuls general, are women Foreign Service officers. In recently recruited batches of officers, the representation of women is almost 50% of the total. But still, the question persists: are we just following an approach of add and stir by mixing in more female Foreign Service recruits into their general service mix, or are these young women enabled to bring their own visions of the world and the region to bear on the conduct of India's diplomacy so as to imbue it with feminine gravitas and meaning? A number of our distinguished women forebears have illuminated the pathways for future women entrants into the Foreign Service. The Asian Relations Conference of 1947 here in New Delhi was presided over by Sarojini Naidu, who spoke of freedom, fellowship, and equality, and announced that, I quote, "The long night of India is coming to an end. Remember, the night of darkness is over," unquote. I remember Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who played such a significant role in nurturing the India International Center, speaking of men and women going forward together, comrades of the road, and who saw her calling as public service, not public office, and whose world view should cast her as the guardian angel of Indian women diplomats. Speaking presciently in the 1940s, before our independence, she drew attention to India's insular-peninsular outline having widened into the global with an increased awareness that we and the rest of the world are but part of a single sphere, that our destinies are inevitably linked, our paths interlocked. India is more than a test, it is a symbol. It is the mirror in which the world sees the shape of things to be. It is towards a world which recognizes the right of every nation to determine and rule its own destiny, but in a cooperative world order that the women of India and of the world have to strive for if humanity is ever to enjoy decency, peace, and happiness. 75 years ago, at the dawn of our freedom, a number of very distinguished, independent-minded Indian women were leading the way for millions of their sisters across this vast land. Think of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who was being dispatched to Stalin's Soviet Union as the first woman ambassador to that country, and who was told at that time that an ambassador's job is not for a woman, a trope that may still find voice today, although the media was kinder to her when it called her the little lady who could hold the scene in Russia, even if Napoleon and Hitler got lost on the steppes. When asked by a woman journalist on arrival in the United States, where she was sent again as ambassador after her stint in the Soviet Union, I quote, "Mrs. Pandit, how does it feel to be world feminist number one?" unquote. And Mrs. Pandit said, I quote, "I am not a feminist. As far as I can see, the question of being male or female has nothing to do with the duty of both sexes to take their part in world affairs," unquote. the duty of both sexes to take their part in world affairs. I believe that is the key. All that is human should concern us, matters of war and peace, progress and development, human advancement and human misery, power, hegemony, domination, discrimination, militarization, aggression, peacemaking, and peace building. In preparing this lecture, I decided I should delve a little more into the life and times of Lakshmi Menon, who distinguished herself as India's Minister of State for External Affairs at the time of the Chinese invasion of 1962, and also as the delegate from India to the United Nations General Assembly's Third Committee in 1948. It was Mrs. Menon who argued the case for incorporating non-discrimination based on sex throughout the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Born in 1899, she was already known in her 20s as a woman who spoke her mind, who was a talented orator and writer, who was speaking up for the rights of women. I came across this description of the young Lakshmi by the British Divan of Travancore, M.E. Watts, as, I quote, headstrong, mannish, and full of the perfervid spirit that espouses lost causes, unquote, which recalled British MP Mark Sykes' description of Gertrude Bell, the Arabist, as, I quote, a flat-chested, man-woman, globe-trotting, forgive the language, rump-wagging, blathering ass, unquote, when actually Bell was widely regarded as a combination of masculine vigor, hard common sense, and practical efficiency, all tempered by feminine charm and a most romantic spirit. The world of diplomacy needed this generation of mannish women to show the way against gender-based discrimination and for speaking out against entitled men so used to their rights and privileges and sacrosanct place in society, so much so that outspoken women can actually threaten their sense of entitlement. These early 20th century women like Lakshmi Menon and her compatriot Anna Chandy, the lawyer, who spoke thus as a mere 24-year-old, enabled us women to walk and even run today. And quoting from Anna Chandy, as long as all men are not dafedars, all women will not be peons. Just as the members of the male race range from emperors to sweepers, there will be members of the female race ranging from empresses to sweepers, unquote. In India today, very few of us remember these pioneering women of the early 20th century, margadarshaks in such an epic sense. Is it because, as a researcher noted recently, diplomatic history is written by men and about men? How many portraits of these early women diplomats grace our corridors of power? How can we engrave their stories on the mindscape of public memory today, particularly so that young women are inspired by them? Barriers do not dissolve easily. As the British writer Helen McCarthy observes, the presence of women at leadership level in global summits, even today, is limited and exceptional, and there is a tendency to hold women to a higher standard. McCarthy notes, I quote, even in the 21st century, woman wielding serious power in the global political arena is an oddity, a phenomenon to be explained rather than taken for granted. Not only is her performance subject to closer scrutiny than her male peers, but it often comes to stand a test of the ability of all women and to reflect, for good or ill, the wisdom of allowing a woman to do a man's job." Unquote. When it comes to assessing what a woman's contribution to peace and diplomacy can be, we cannot but be oblivious to the great deal of strident masculinity we see in responses to situations around the world in need of solutions. Negotiation and compromise have lesser value as also the idea of a commons where people of the world share and include rather than exclude or marginalize. Women would see the task of diplomacy as the creation of a world in which we feel safe, settled, and happy, where prosperity and security can reinforce each other. A woman's agenda in diplomacy would focus on the need for millions of people around the world who need a ticket to ride if they are to catch the train to all-round development, and to build, using a phrase from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, concepts of fraternity, breaking down the divisions that separate through dialogue and inclusiveness. I once said that diplomacy is basically gender neutral. It does not occupy itself with a his and a hers differentiation. It is the art of ensuring peace and preventing war and conflict, of skillful and quiet negotiation, of adeptness of communication. For instance, a foreign policy for women in our region would embrace the idea of a South Asian commons. It would speak and act in favor not of ravaging disunities. This is a phrase I borrowed from Aga Shahid Ali, but of rationalizing unities and of merging capacities to build, to develop, to link. It would weigh the interests of humanitarianism against the interests of power. It would feel the true pulse of the unknown, the marginalized, the excluded, understanding the economics of proximity rather than promoting proximity as a peril. Of course, I was also cautioned by a mainly male audience that this pipe dream would die before it was even conceived, that it was disappointing and a waste of time. But I do also see that two women of a younger generation than mine, from India and Pakistan, Elsa de Silva and Curatiline Fatima, were thinking on these lines when they argued in favor of the need for participation of women's groups for a peace process between India and Pakistan, and that, I quote, both countries share a common failure to involve women in the relationship building process, unquote, and that given that, I quote, peace and gender equality generally go hand in hand, promoting the role of women would be a key to breaking the deadlock in South Asia, unquote. Some of the measures they suggested were create spaces for dialogue between the two countries and across different sectors, such as women in business, women in politics, women in media, women in the development sector, etc. This would help women form coalitions, but also serve to create support systems. Exchanging best practices and ideas can help strengthen efforts on both sides. But first, people should be allowed to visit each other and the stringent visa rules lifted. Secondly, invite representatives from these groups into the peace discussions. It is essential to bring them to the table so that a holistic perspective can be taken into consideration. Negotiators involved in peace processes in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Somalia report that even when female participants initially met with hostility from their male counterparts, they ultimately developed a reputation for building trust, engaging all sides, and fostering dialogue in otherwise acrimonious settings. Thirdly, train women to be on-ground implementers of peace and address the trauma associated with hate and violence to start the healing process. In Burundi and Bosnia, women have been at the forefront of community-based conflict reconciliation and resolution projects. In Northern Ireland, women collaborated on cross-community programs relating to childcare, health, and microenterprises, instrumental in fostering positive peace. Fourthly, invest in women, and not just through financial allocation, but also through other resources like education and creation of an ecosystem that can raise the status of women to exercise their rights with freedom and safety through increased political and economic participation. And lastly, go beyond religion and work together as people. If designed well, such a peace program could help heal the trauma of the divide between the two countries by involving leaders who will spread the message of peace. I know that Dr. Gopinath has fostered these very same ideas in her excellent and pioneering work over the last 2 decades in the WISCOM project. All strength to her. May we see more and more women with sharp elbows who nudge men to make more space for women. Talking of men in suits determining the future of the universe, in the real locus of power, the UN Security Council, decisions are determined by the raw calculus of strategic interest. Even beyond the cases of Libya and Syria and Iraq and now the Ukraine show the complete insensitivity to the facet of human dislocation, the destruction of societies and human heritage, the erasing of borders, and the effects on the welfare of women and children. We are yet to find a way in which we can combine feminine soft power or smart power with masculine hard power to create that ideal Purusha and Prakriti in diplomacy. What do women need most, regardless of what their professional field of choice is? I believe it is voice, that which enables them to articulate their cause, their interests, and their aspirations. And voice needs amplification, the amplification that comes from numbers, from adequate representation. If women constitute 50% of the population, it is obvious that their representation in professions and in leadership positions should be equal to, or at least close to equal to that of men who are similarly placed. That, of course, is happening in Indian diplomatic circles today, with the rising numbers of women in the Foreign Service. But do we see the impact of these women as leaders, their conditioning as one half of humanity, their composite modes of thinking on the building and articulation of policy, in activating the dreams of a Kamala Devi, a Hansa Mehta, or a Lakshmi Kuti Amma, as Lakshmi Menon was known in her youth? The third aspect over voice and amplification relates to service conditions. In my own experience, women in the Indian Foreign Service have undertaken a long march to the present day, from the days in which the stain of sex determination prevailed. These are the words of Justice Krishna Iyer, where married women diplomats could not continue to work, where you could not apply to join the Foreign Service if you were married, and where you could scarcely aspire to the top positions of responsibility in the service. The famous Supreme Court case of Ambassador C.B. Muttama, a pioneering woman member of the Indian Foreign Service, is an example. In fact, Justice Krishna Iyer spoke in his judgment during the Muttama case of the masculine hubris within the Indian Foreign Service and misogynistic service rules affecting female officers that needed immediate course correction, which of course did ensue. The Supreme Court case, as you know, of Ambassador Muttama was more than 4 decades ago. But again, it has been observed there is no single glass ceiling for women. When one is broken, a series of more glass ceilings still remain to be accessed and shattered. And there are glass cliffs out there which men take care to avoid, but which women could be hapless victims of, as we saw in the case of Theresa May during Brexit. Quite apart from that, it took half a century after the establishment of our Foreign Service for the first woman Foreign Secretary, the first woman Foreign Secretary to be appointed, for instance. And there have been in the whole history of the service only 3 women that have held the office of Foreign Secretary until date. Concepts of inclusion of women are still not complete, and the status quo is yet to be fully breached. Women in the service, I believe, can particularly impact service planning, service conditions, administrative reform, public diplomacy strategy, development diplomacy, soft power enunciation, and the provision of inputs in security and foreign policy that amplify the space for dialogue, connectivity across borders, confidence-building measures, demilitarization, and mechanisms for tension diffusing and reduction. Senior women officers in the service should mentor their younger women colleagues, literally becoming their sponsors, who share their lived experience with their little sisters. Ultimately, it is all a question of parity, inclusion, equity, and equality in service conditions for women, and also about men and women who can be mentors to younger women in the workplace who can stick their necks out for you. We cannot increase the numbers of women in the workspace just because some boxes have to be ticked. Women in diplomacy also need to develop the confidence to show their uniqueness, to create their own music, as someone once said, not to imitate or be others. They need role models. Women must support women. We must cultivate sisterhood. Our lived experiences need to be documented and our stories told. They cannot just remain in our cell memories. Younger women diplomats have to be inspired to become inspirational enough to give voice to a world order run by 5 women in pantsuits or saris, who maintain that foreign policy is relevant to all of us, equally as women, just as men, feel this policy space is theirs or have felt so all these years, and get them to realize that girls and women like us are equal players who demand respect and being listened to. It is not only women's issues that should concern women diplomats, but issues of human health, human security, pandemics, trade negotiations, migration, refugees, economic sanctions, peace treaties, border agreements, maritime law and disputes, cross-border movements, including fisheries, statelessness, and much more. To that list, I would also add counterterrorism. Lakshmi Menon was not off the mark when she noted all those years ago that the greatest, the most persistent, and subtle opposition to women's participation, especially at the higher levels, comes from the reluctance of men to share or surrender power. Said Shri, I quote, "A woman here and a woman there may be holding a position high enough to be marked, but one swallow does not make a summer," unquote. She added a passionate plea for the participation of more and more women at the policy-making and managerial levels, I quote, "so that their thinking and planning for a peaceful world order could be brought within the realms of possibility," unquote. You cannot empower women if you do not give them power. But just imagine you are a fly on the wall, listening to a conversation in a room filled with men in suits talking about their women colleagues. Can we say with all honesty that such conversations are not full of tropes, often visceral, about women in the workspace and dealing with them? In the public space, outside the work area, women on social media, for instance, are the targets, as I have often experienced personally, of character assassination and even body shaming. It is what the young and brilliant Kirti Jayakumar of the Gender and Security Project calls microaggressions that we constantly face as women who speak out in a society where men regard themselves as the default setting, where mansplaining is a given and everything is tailored for a man's world with its militarized discourse about warriors against all enemies, real or imagined. We women, as Meenakshi Gopinath recently mentioned, are there to comfort the afflicted, but we must also afflict the comfortable. We are there to teach the world to live attentively, to hear the fluttering of the wings, to turn maps around. We must unscramble the discourse. We must not only survive, but thrive, and do it with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style, as Maya Angelou once said. And as advice for women everywhere, particularly in the official space, we must learn not to take ourselves too seriously, understand that strength has flexibility and flexibility has strength. Understand the music within us and let it play. The writer, academic, and researcher Swarna Rajagopalan, whose work I follow with interest, said recently that we need lobbying for women to be included in every part of the foreign policy establishment, and that this should be the point of departure for feminist engagement with foreign policy. That we need advocacy in terms of such goals as enabling focus on the importance and impact to non-official, non-traditional concerns, for example, emigration and visa issues, constraints on the movement of people, goods, and ideas, minimizing barriers between countries and individuals, and the elimination of gender-based violence and torture within the larger compact of human rights. As Isabel Allende said recently, why are aggression and violence against women not regarded as an infringement of women's human rights? The U.S. state of Hawaii recently launched a feminist recovery plan for the pandemic, which centers women at the heart of the policy response. It is called Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs. We have to address issues like water, sanitation, hygiene, housing, the gender-digital divide, environmental concerns, inequalities in employment, wages, and the quality of life. When diplomacy focuses on development, these are issues that should occupy our policymakers because they benefit women and society as a whole. So, an intersectional analysis is required in our approach to overcoming the effects of the pandemic. At every cross-section, there stands a woman in need for equal access to opportunities. women in the Foreign Service should be able to infuse the policy debate and planning with their ideas and enunciation of such a focus in our diplomatic strategies, particularly in the neighborhood. For democracy to thrive without women is impossible, and just so, our workspaces will be imperfect and incomplete without women. As women, equality is what we aspire to and what we want, and we will not be encased by definitions. As I have said before, when women are victims of war and social, political, and economic upheaval, when they are anchorless migrants cast upon a river of no return, left to fend for their hapless children, when they are exploited in conflict and left agencyless, should we not hear more women's voices shaping agendas and outcomes so that more sense and sensibility prevails? Countries are not summarily wiped off the map in acts of hegemonic hubris, and the whirlwind reaped under the perceived responsibility to protect. The question I ask is, can diplomacy organize itself more effectively so that outcomes take into account the interests of these largely silent multitudes that comprise men? Can women acquire agency and make themselves more effectively heard? I have been reading the wartime diary of Yevgenia Belorusets from Kiev these last few days, and understanding the bestiality of war and the illusions it creates, a play whose plot, in her words, is like a play whose plot is told in a preamble, or like a fulfilled prophecy, and how, despite this prediction, when you wake up in the midst of war, it remains the same, still unimaginable. One factor that is often remarked upon is that those women who make it to the top echelons of diplomatic life seem to have no option but to adopt approaches that differ little from their male colleagues. Is diplomacy then a straitjacket, restrictive, offering little scope for the articulation of the female voice? How often is that voice heard across the climate-controlled portals of international affairs? It seems to me that too few women are seen in that world, and even those that are there are few and far between, to be celebrated no doubt, but not wrestlers in the amphitheater. The glass ceiling is not so easily shattered. The contributions of women are mostly overlooked or sidelined. We are yet to find a way in which to create that ideal blend of yin and yang in the universe of diplomacy. The problem of a not insignificant number of chauvinistic men in the workplace is a global problem. When placed in situations where the woman is isolated among a cabinet of males, the question of being solely guided by a womanly perspective does not arise. She exercises her judgment as the need of the hour dictates, and perhaps she is at pains to demonstrate that she is no less equal to men in taking masculine decisions. Iron Lady is another masculine term for women in power. No less than a man is what is implied. The problem may not go away with just increasing numbers. Most top diplomatic positions in the world today are male. As a recent study pointed out, crucially, we still have very little knowledge of where women and men are positioned and located in diplomacy. When we compare and look at senior negotiation positions, the number of women is even lower. An often quoted study from UN Women, 2012, reveals that women only constitute 9% of all negotiators, 2.5% of all chief mediators, and 4% of signatories. And yet another study has noted, I quote, centrally located male networks may shape recruitment and career development, Perhaps senior men are more likely to see, encourage, and involve men as junior colleagues, making it easier for junior men than women to feel supported and encouraged to take steps to advance the career. Also, the issue of overt or subtle signaling to women that they are not suitable for diplomacy needs to be analyzed further. Such signaling can have various grounds. There may be fear that women cannot network effectively in male-dominated environments, fear that women cannot combine a demanding diplomatic career with marriage and parenthood, reluctance to place women in violent contexts, or ideas about women's inability to control their emotions or keep secrets, unquote. And it's also obvious that Hobbesian values of war and security prevail. It is as if, as one scholar said, Aristotle's views on women as non-developed males persist. Diplomacy is still conceptualized as male-ordained, and patriarchy is not extinct. Nowhere is male patriarchy more in play than in the universe of social media, as I just mentioned. The trend is to overwhelm any point of view that does not conform to the stipulated common denominator of what constitutes the truth. Excuse me. Female opinions are subject to constant mansplaining by Twitter handles that are anonymous and ignorant. But social media, by way of its expansiveness and universal outreach, requires to be the arena where female views and feminist opinions must be freely propagated and accommodated so that they take root and refuse to be dismissed by trolls or alt news makers. It offers the scope of advocacy and the creation of agency. Women have a predisposition to diplomacy. It is wired into our genes. Aristophanes' comedy, Lysistrata, 400 BC, is about women from 3 different cities who, frustrated by the lack of success of men in matters of war and peace, organized themselves to end the Peloponnesian War. The metaphor Aristophanes used for the work of these women was weaving, I quote, to portray women of exceptional diplomatic ability who pull together the strands of society to negotiate peace and weave the fabric of nations. In an ideal world, there would be recognition of these innate qualities of women, but life is far from perfect, and the inescapable reality is that men, as it has been said, have the muscle, the media, and the money to back them up, even as we women weave the fabric of diplomacy on the charkhas of life. The union of equality that we need, equality for all, the sharing of strengths of men and women, should be our goal. Given that nationally the policy of our government is to further the cause and welfare of our female population, their health, education, livelihoods, and their upward mobility and representation in key national institutions, there should be no barrier in our articulating these basic values in the definition of our global outlook and our foreign policy. For instance, the government could consider appointing a female ambassador for global women's issues, as the Obama administration did with Milan Verveer, or create an office for policy planning on women in foreign policy that would work or that would look at the whole gamut of women's representation in policy making, ensuring that women's issues, inclusion, and diversity find a place in our development diplomacy, disaster management, humanitarian assistance, and also in regional cooperation in trade, education, and health, as also ensuring a voice for women in conflict prevention and peacemaking, as well as peace building. Contrary to popular belief, a feminist foreign policy is not a pacifist foreign policy. It is about having tough conversations in a graceful way. What is important is to balance diplomacy and defense and use diplomacy as the first line of defense so that the decisions we take will lead to more stability. Our decisions should be based on solid data analysis, and we should integrate gender equality into the working of our foreign policy using the data from research in the field to avoid unintended consequences in the working of policy. In conclusion, at the risk of repeating myself, I often wonder what an inclusivist foreign policy for South Asia would look like. Can we not consider a discourse that speaks of matters beyond war and peace? Peace in the South Asian subcontinent seems to be associated with white flags, surrender, submission, weakness. Do we think of a South Asian commons, not an arena for mutual jousting where we bait each other in blood sport, but a space for maturity of peaceful purpose, robust civility, and mutual accommodation? We have built towering Babels around ourselves, but we have not cleared a way for the commons. I'm sure that in India, feminists from both genders, male and female, recognize the need for such a commons, a Maidan for the celebration of life, not war, not militarization, and not blood vendettas. Thank you.